The genealogies of Genesis 5 and 11 have drawn much debate and speculation. Many feel the numbers are meant to be taken literally, and from them we are able to calculate biblical events prior to this. This would make sense if the genealogies were written with our culture in mind. But what does the biblical and cultural context suggest? The ages in Genesis 5 have become a stumbling block for many, mainly because it seems astronomically impossible that anyone could live past the age of 900, let alone the age of 200. Especially because similar texts from that time period record the average age was around 70 to 80. Some young Earth creationists have simply bit the bullet on this one and take the ages to be literal, positing all sorts of theories to suggest how people could have lived past the age of 900. All of which seem improbable when you look at the science. The only one I found that could be remotely possible is that Adam was able to eat from the tree of life before he and Eve were cut off from it, and the tree made them and their immediate descendants live much longer lives that eventually faded down to normal ages through several generations. But perhaps we are being too hasty in assuming these need to be understood as literal. Numbers, even in our own culture, are not always meant to be taken literally, and evidence from the ancient Near East seems to suggest a symbolic usage of numbers was used even more. For example, during the construction of his palace, Sargon II said, "I built the circumference of the city wall, 16,283 cubits, the number of my name." Joran Freeburg notes the numbers 60, 600, and 3,600 are used symbolically in Babylonian mathematics and astronomy. At the city of Emer, it records, 120 years are the years of mankind, verily it is their bane. Which is an interesting parallel to biblical passages. At Emer, it most likely is an ideal number for mankind, since another text from that city says the average age was 70 to 80. Karen Ray Nimitnijit says, "The Mesopotamians assigned numerical value to each sign. Thus every name had a corresponding numerical value." Likewise, even in our own culture, we can use numbers symbolically without literal numerical meaning. What if I told you my wife is a 10? Is anyone going to accuse me of marrying a child? What if I said I'll be there in 5 minutes? Are you going to expect me to be there in exactly 300 seconds? Or do you recognize the use of 5 to be a symbolic representation to mean I'll be arriving shortly? I also have a personal family example. My grandfather's lucky number was 318. Now, if I told you his number was 318, it would be absurd to think that was his age when he died. It was simply a symbolic number for him. Scholars have noted for years, biblical authors readily use and play with numbers for symbolic means. The most obvious is in the genealogy that's found in the Gospel of Matthew, where he specifically leaves out and duplicates generations in order to get 3 perfect sets of 14, totaling 42 generations from Abraham to Christ. No one can be true to the text and assume Matthew is being literal. It is clear when you read the genealogies and chronicles. This is not recognized by scholars as a blunder on Matthew's part, but an attempt to use numbers to express a symbolic message that Jesus is the Messiah. And this is not the only example. The book of Revelation uses multiple examples of symbolic numbers, such as 666 as the number of the beast, 144,000 at Zion, and the number 7 shows up multiple times to symbolize God's perfection and completion. Also, 7 is an important symbolic number that shows up multiple times in Genesis to indicate God's perfect rulership or completion. Interestingly enough, there is a strong indication that the ages of several of Israel's patriarchs were actually ideal numbers and not their literal ages. Kenneth Kitchen notes the odd age of Joseph and Joshua, who both have strong affinity with Egypt. Both men are said to have lived to the age of 110, the ideal age in Egyptian inscriptions. Essentially, the biblical authors are saying both men lived the perfect Egyptian life. Mir Bar Ilan highlights the age of Sarah, at 127, which combines two ideal numbers in the Bible and has correlations to other ancient works as an ideal number. Nahum Sarna also notes the ages from Abraham to Jacob show a mathematical formula ending in Jacob's whole life and from the time he was named Israel. This is not an opinion, it is math. Coincidences like this do not occur. Abraham is given 75 years in his father's house and 75 years with his son. He was 100 when his son was born and lived in Canaan 100 years. Jacob lived 17 years with Joseph and then another 17 years with him in Egypt. On top of this, Craig Olson notes there are implicit statements in the stories about the patriarchs that indicate the ages cannot be literal. For example, Genesis 25 says Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. The text also records elsewhere, Abraham lived to be 175. But this wouldn't make sense with his ancestry. Abraham would have died young by the standard of those who came before him. In fact, his ancestor Eber would have outlived him. Abraham's death would have been a travesty, a sign the lives of humans were deteriorating. So if the age is literal, it doesn't make sense to say Abraham died in a good old age. He died quite young and was not an old man. Genesis 17 records that Abraham laughed at the prospect of having a child past the age of 100. But if the ages of his ancestors were literal, why would he laugh? He would have known many of his ancestors were born when their fathers passed the age of 100. In fact, by doing the math of Genesis 12, it would mean Terah would have fathered Abraham when he was 130. Yet Abraham thinks people over the age of 100 simply do not have children, thus implying the ages are not literal, but symbolic representations. Sarna explains, it is clear that the biblical chronologies of the patriarchal age are not intended to be accurate historical records in our sense of the term. The numbers used are an expression of the biblical interpretation of history as the unfolding of the divine plan on the human scene. Correlating with this, if you add up the ages of all the patriarchs from Adam to Moses, you get 12,600. A derivative of this number shows up in Revelation as a symbolic number of God's unfolding plan, or a time of preparation. The ages are not coincidental. Moses brings Israel into the Promised Land, which was viewed by Israel as a new Eden. So from Eden to Eden, you have a symbolic number show up to symbolize God preparing to bring his people back into a land where his presence resides. The age of Moses is one of the most obvious cases of symbolism. Deuteronomy 34:7 says, Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eyes were undimmed and his vigor unabated. As we noted, this is an ideal number in the biblical text and at the city of Emer. Mir Bar Ilan says, Moses' corporeal talents were perfect until his very last day, and it looks as if the whole number of 120 denotes some kind of perfection. No doubt the number 12 denotes time, since there were always 12 months in a year, so 12 denotes a whole circle of time, and a complete circle denotes perfect by itself. And it is clear that 10 denotes corporal talents, because each has 10 fingers. In other words, the text directly tells us why 120 was given to Moses. His talents were perfect until the completion of his life. With this in mind, let's turn back to the genealogies of Genesis 5 and 11. Kenneth Matthews notes the ages in Genesis 5 vary between the Masoretic text, the Septuagint, and the Samaritan Pentateuch. If the ages are meant to be literal, this would create a theological problem. But if the ages are symbolic for theological messaging, then these variants pose no problem, in the same way Matthew adjusting Jesus' genealogy for theological messaging doesn't pose an issue. The variants are likely the result of a cultural norm that the numbers are fluid and can be adjusted to give theological significance. R.R. Wilson says, even though the genealogies may be fluid and tendentious, they are still valuable historical sources, provided their nature and functions are taken into account. In addition, in a number of cases, when we compared parallel genealogies, we found them to be identical. So until we have evidence to the contrary, we must consider them to be accurate and potentially valuable historical sources. In other words, even if the numbers are not literal, that doesn't mean the author is suggesting the patriarchs didn't exist. As W.E. Alfrecht said, "It is inaccurate to say that these genealogies do not represent reliable facts. It is more accurate to say that the conception of history, for and by which they were maintained, caused them to develop in certain ways." In other words, they were written in a culture that used symbolic numbers and mathematical formulas. But it would be inaccurate to say that means the author meant for it to be understood as entirely fictional. That would be a slippery slope fallacy and assume more that is being said. Many argue the ages have to be literal because they appear random and are not ideal numbers that show up in other places in Scripture. Well, this is partially true, but that is because scholars recognize they are mathematical formulas utilizing a sexagesimal counting system, or base 60. Ancient Sumerians and Babylonians didn't count like us. We use a decimal system, a base 10 system, because we have 10 fingers. So a new set starts at 10, 20, 30, and so on. This is not how ancient Sumerians counted, but with a base 60 system. They would count the 12 segments of the 4 fingers, and then multiply that by 5 fingers, which gets you to 60. The ancient base 60 system is where we get 360 degrees in a circle, or time segments of 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes in an hour. The Mesopotamians had a 360-day year calendar, with a 13th month added every 6 years to make up for the missing days. Considering the biblical story begins in the area of Sumer before Abraham moves to Canaan, this would correlate nicely. Now, notice 21 of the 30 ages listed are divisible by 5, and another 8 become divisible by 5 by subtracting 7, and the last does as well by adding multiples of 7. This is an odd coincidence. Kenton Sparks notes the odds of all 30 ages coincidentally ending in either a 0, 2, 5, 7, or 9 is 0.0000006% possible. Lloyd Bailey compared this with a list of kings that reigned in Israel and Judah from the Book of Kings, all of which end in every available number of a decimal system. Only 5 are divisible by 5, and no pattern forms. The sequence is truly random. The genealogies in Genesis 5 and 11 do not seem to be. When you look at Genesis 5 and 11 in light of this, a pattern emerges. All of these ages correlate with a base 60 numerical system, and were probably used to express symbolic importance, perhaps representing their character, accomplishments, or relationship with God. Lloyd Bailey says, "Such analysis and comparison does not suggest that the biblical figures are not true. Rather, it raises the possibility that they depict a mode of truth that differs from modern concern with chronological accuracy." In other words, the biblical authors were not interested in exact chronology, like we put a strong emphasis on today. This is a misreading of Scripture with modern lenses. Rather, the biblical authors were using symbolic numbers to represent the unfolding of God's plan from Adam to Abraham down to Moses. The numbers of each patriarch have some symbolic importance. Although we do not know entirely what each individual age is meant to represent, additional clues still speak to this. For example, it is not by accident Enoch, who walked with God, was the 7th from Adam. There is that sacred number 7 again. His age was exactly 365 years, correlating to the 365 days of a solar year. Both numbers probably correlate to information specifically about Enoch, perhaps representing completion in some way. The Lamech of Seth's line is 777, contrasting him with Lamech, the descendant of Cain, who boasted a 77-fold vengeance. Lamech is also the son of Methuselah, whose gematria is exactly 777. This might represent Lamech's moral character for blessing his son Noah, the flood hero. Interestingly enough, the use of the base 60 system is seen in Genesis 1 to 11. But after that, with Abraham and his descendants, specific ideal numbers seem to be used. This seems to be a reoccurring cultural theme until the times when Chronicles and Kings were written, where exact literal number usage is applied more. This would suggest different authors for each section, and could possibly represent different time periods. Genesis 1 to 11 may be a much older tradition than the later history of Abraham's descendants, and that having been written long before later biblical texts that use literal numbers more often within a decimal system. However, the use of base 60 in ideal numbers did not die out during later time periods. But the use of a base 60 system in Genesis 1 to 11 seems to imply different authors for the first sections of Genesis, and could also be a much older tradition than the rest of Genesis, and show more affinity to ancient Sumer, whereas the time of Abraham and his descendants show more affinity to Egypt and the cities in Canaan. Building on this, the genealogies of Genesis 5 and 11 find interesting parallels in ancient Sumerian king lists. The Sumerians listed their reigns of ancient kings also by using a base 60 counting system, with the main difference being their reigns are calculable with a 60 squared unit. Beyond that, there are correlations and important differences between both lists. To start, Genesis 7 says Noah was 600 when the flood began, whereas the Sumerian equivalent, Zusudra, was 36,000 years, 600 multiplied by 60. The seventh from Adam is Enoch, who parallels the sevenths in the Sumerian king lists, who was said to be summoned to heaven, similar to God taking Enoch. Later, a cult city developed around this specific person at Sippor, which was a well-known place of solar worship. There might be a correlation in that Enoch was said to be 365 when God took him, the total number of days in a solar year. The parallels are interesting, and both might share common sources or oral traditions, but Richard Hess cautions against suggesting there is direct copying going on for numerous reasons. First, Hess notes the genealogies in the ancient Near East are connected with succession of office holders. This is not the case with the genealogies in Genesis 4, 5, 10, or 11. The aim of the Genesis genealogies doesn't seem to be landholdings or political succession. Next, the aim of the other genealogies is to give a descended figure a certain royal or official status. This is absent in Genesis 4 and 5, and instead, each genealogy ends with acts that bring about condemnation, not a claim to a title or status. Third, the king lists do not include ages at which the next king was begotten, like in Genesis 5 and 11, where there is an emphasis on tracing down bloodlines. Fourth, the king lists in Genesis seem to be working in opposite directions. Richard Hess says, in the former, the use of the kinship term son in describing the relation between generations gives the genealogies an impression of direction that moves from the latest generation to the earliest. In the biblical genealogies of Genesis 4, 5, and 11, no such term as son is ever used in the formulas to describe the kinship relations between each generation. It only appears in Genesis 5 and 11 to describe the birth of additional sons and daughters. But the focus in relations between generations is one of the father begetting the son. This means there is a genealogical movement from the earliest ancestor to the latest, the opposite of that of the other genealogies in the ancient Near East. Hess also notes each cultural's genealogies function differently. The emphasis in Genesis is on begetting and then dying, which shows a lack of ancestral cult development, and focuses more on moving the timeline forward rather than looking back for ideal figures in ideal times. In fact, the emphasis in Genesis is more about the failures of humanity, not ideal models to look back to. The past is to be learned from, not idealized. Hess summarizes, the differences in the form and function of these two collections of texts suggest that attempts to make comparisons proceed with caution, and that the context of the texts themselves within their particular literary and cultural world be the controlling factor in interpretation. The king lists consistently suggest a backward movement in time, while the biblical genealogies move forward in time. This would suggest a different purpose for the two forms of literature. This also seems to be the case with the Table of Nations, which remains distinct in terms of its breadth of scope. Thus, similarities between the different genealogies are probably a result of cultural similarities and customs, not necessarily direct copying. Both cultures seem to be using a base 60 system, and the number 7 for specific theological or cultural purposes. Richard Averbeck, surveying the research, notes most of what we can say is there was significant but indirect influence between Sumerian literature and the Hebrew Bible. One feature that is often missed in Genesis is the authors seem to be trying to get equal sets between important figures, like Matthew does with his 3 sets of 14 generations. Genesis specifically has 10 generations from Adam to Noah, and then 10 generations from Noah's son to Abraham, whereas the Sumerian king lists only have 8 generations before the flood. Thus, it is quite likely the 2 perfect sets of 10 in Genesis are not a coincidence, and much like what Matthew did with his 3 sets of 14 generations from Abraham to Jesus. The authors of Genesis have probably left out generations within the timeline to get 2 perfect sets of 10. Similar techniques were done by other Jewish authors. Demetrius fabricated ages in order to fit a predetermined value. Eupolemus utilized patterns of 480 years to coincide with the Maccabean liberation of Jerusalem. Jubilees condensed, ignored, and changed biblical chronologies to make Israel's history into a series of jubilees of years. This seems to be a recurring cultural theme. This technique could have been used in order to get Enoch specifically at the 7th generation. A similar thing occurs in David's genealogy in Ruth 4. 10 generations are mentioned, from Perez to David, but many are probably left out to ensure Boaz is the 7th name mentioned, thus giving significance to Boaz. Something similar may have happened in Genesis 5 with Enoch. But more importantly, this would mean the aim was never to pass on exact chronology from creation to the present, as some young earth creationists believe, but their aim was probably more to connect Israel back to Adam for theological and covenantal reasons. Adam was the first priest of God and would have resided over the first covenant God made with mankind. Yet the covenant was broken and they were exiled, but God said the seed of the woman would one day defeat the seed of the serpent. The biological lines were traced down in hopes of finding the seed to replace Adam. The descending generations were meant to show the progress of mankind as they move further away from God and the need for a new Adam to take his place. Lamech suspected his son would be that man, but problems resulted after the flood, which demonstrate that could not be the case, and so the line must continue down until the new Adam comes.